Welcome, everyone. My name is Vinny Birkenmeyer. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Director of Residential Life at Pace University in Pleasantville, New York. That's where I'm zooming in from today. I'm here today in my capacity as the chair for the Public Policy Advisory Committee for ACUHO-I. Our chair-elect, Charles Holmes Hope, is here as well, and will be in the background answering some questions, doing some stuff on the chat. So we're really excited. If you hear us say PPAC, that's what we call our group within ACUHO-I, our Public Policy Advisory Committee. So PPAC is very excited to have folks joining us today and to have Wendy with us from the University of Vermont, who will be sharing on this topic, which we've been talking about in PPAC a lot. We know is coming up more and more as we have conversations around new legislation at the state level, some pending legislation, and changing environments at the federal level. This is what we're talking about all the time in PPAC. So if these are conversations that interest you, really PPAC exists as a group within ACUHO-I to, first off, just provide a space to talk about where legislation intersects with our work. So sometimes that's staffing and labor laws. Sometimes that's building and zoning. Funding, pandemics, as many of us saw, DEI work, as many of our colleagues are working through with new legislation coming about in certain states. And then just, policies and laws we've kind of intersected with over the years. So we have conversations around specific topics, things that are coming up in certain states and national legislation all the time. We also help ACUHO-I where appropriate with memorandums or statements on legislation, or if we're taking a stand as ACUHO-I, which is becoming increasingly more important in our work. So this is the plug portion. If these are conversations you want to have beyond 12 to 1 Eastern time today, we meet every third Thursday of the month from 12 to 1 Eastern Standard on Zoom. I'll put my email in the chat. All you need to do is send me an email and I'll get you added into our member roster with the ACUHO-I staff and get you the Zoom invite for those meetings. We offer sessions like this outside of our meetings in a virtual format, usually 2 or 3 a year. We will also be at Campus Home Live, which for folks that have been around ACUHO-I for a while, the annual conference has kind of had a rebrand. So if you hear folks talk about Campus Home live, that's the annual conference. Will be in Portland this year. And PPAC always hosts at least one session. And this year that session is going to be on the intersection of state legislation and housing work. So a really good flow from today's conversation into an in-person discussion for folks that can join us in Portland. We're going to be in that first educational block. We're going to have a mix of folks. It's going to be kind of like roundtable and panel discussion. So if you're at the annual conference this year, we hope to see you there. So without further ado, why everyone is here today is to hear from our wonderful colleague and guest speaker, Wendy Koenig. I'm going to introduce Wendy in a second, and then she's going to take it away with some formal presentation piece, and we'll have some time for questions and comments at the end. Wendy will talk about this as well, but if you have questions that pop up throughout, feel free to put them in the chat. Charles and I will ask them either throughout or at the end. But yeah, so Wendy has a broad range of experience relating to higher education, politics, and business. She joined UVM in 2008 and currently serves as Executive Director of Government Relations, advancing the strategic imperatives of the university through engagement of external stakeholders in federal, state, and local government. Wendy partners with university leadership to develop and execute UVM's legislative strategies and provides counsel on state and federal policy decisions and initiatives that impact UVM. Wendy began her career in Washington, D.C., working for a grassroots lobbying firm on defense appropriations issues. Over the course of her career, she has worked for a higher education search and consulting firm, opened a flagship office for a new media company in New York City, and led the Association of Vermont Independent Colleges. During her 2 decades in Vermont, Wendy has served on several nonprofit boards, including the Girl Scout Council of Vermont and the Vermont Teacher Diversity Scholarship Program. She is currently secretary of the Board of Trustees of Sterling College in Craftsbury, Vermont. Wendy earned a bachelor's degree at Georgetown University and a JD at the Catholic University of America. So now I'm going to put it over to Wendy as I pull up the presentation, and we will get started. And Wendy's actually joining us in today from Columbus, which is where ACUHO-I is headquartered. So we're excited Wendy can join us.
Thank you, Vinny. And also thanks to Charles. I really appreciate you inviting me to speak to everybody today. I just want to say welcome. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with us talking about campus housing and government relations, which is, as far as I'm concerned, and I don't know, I'm a lawyer, so I might not be, have the same sense of humor as everybody else, but I think it's a hot topic right now and something that's really important. So, Vinny, we can advance the slides if you don't mind. Welcome to everybody, and we go to the next one. So I think that sometimes folks have a little bit of hesitation about working with government relations. Dealing with federal, state, and local governments can be daunting. It can be tedious. It can sometimes be difficult. The question sometimes that I ask myself and others ask is, why should we work together? I think there's opportunities everywhere within federal, state, and local and community relations to help us at the university level advance our goals, especially as we're talking about today, as it relates to housing, student affairs in general. We can, by working together, achieve our goals more easily. We need to have mutual agreement and understanding between our units because it assists us in presenting the university in the best possible light to all of our constituencies. So, if we're talking to our city council in Burlington, for an example, about wanting to achieve some zoning amendments to build more housing for students, it's great to be able to have an existing relationship with your folks in housing or in student affairs to be able to use their expertise in front of a body like the city council. I, as a government relations professional, know a little bit about a lot of things at the university, but I need to be able to know, trust, and call upon my colleagues who work in student affairs and work in housing to be able to speak on behalf of the university because you all are the experts. All of this kind of relationship building and talking with one another and working together really ultimately allows us to serve our students in the best possible way. We exist as the university to educate people, and we want to be able to do that working through our government relations office with our housing folks is one way to achieve the goals of helping students. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about areas of jurisdiction in government relations and why those are important to this conversation about housing for students, faculty, and staff on campuses. So within the federal realm, there are opportunities for funding. Those can come through grants or congressionally directed spending opportunities, formerly known as earmarks. There are not a ton of opportunities at the federal level to actually receive funds to build housing. We normally have to find other ways through philanthropy, through bonding, through state funding, that kind of thing. That can change a little bit through congressionally directed spending. Those monies are more flexible towards capital building or improvements. So renovations, potentially things like if you have student housing that you want to make greener by using solar, hydropower, whatever, you could potentially get money through the federal government for those things. And the other reason why the federal level is important are overall government policies towards housing generally. Right now, I think that in Vermont, we have Bernie Sanders as one of he's now our senior senator with Senator Leahy's retirement. He has he's the chair of Labor H Committee, or the Help Committee as it's known now. And one of his goals is to improve the nursing workforce in Vermont, but another one of his goals is to help us with our housing issue. I think that everybody from all cities and all states can relate to the fact that there's a housing shortage in the United States at this time that exists as a pressure point for colleges and universities because we have so many people who live off campus in our communities that folks feel are sort of squeezing the housing market. I think we'll see as we move over time, more folks at the federal level, and I think it's Republicans and Democrats moving towards more progressive housing laws that allow us to be able to build more easily in order to accommodate the housing crunch that we have. So that's what we can accomplish on the federal level. We can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what we can do at the state level. This is another area for funding. State legislatures have more ability and more freedom to help us with monies for actual building projects. That can take the form of, like in Vermont, the capital bill where we receive monies for things like major maintenance, renovations, those kind of things that can help us with some of the housing projects we have on deck. It also involves work to advance statewide housing policies to our advantage. In the state of Vermont right now, our legislature adjourned about 2 weeks ago, and they spent a lot of their time during this session working on a housing bill that helps us with all aspects of housing, from student housing on campuses to housing for low-income people, and also the ability to do things like change zoning statewide in order to achieve things like accessory dwelling units on pieces of property that open up housing for folks. It can also provide a setting for a larger conversation about higher education issues. I've been called into a bunch of different committees, from workforce development, economic development, education committees, to talk about this issue. How is UVM housing students, and how do we plan on changing that as we move into the future to accommodate more housing in our communities? So that's an area we work on a lot. On the local level, this is sort of where things get interesting. The last bullet says all politics are local in the end. I think that where colleges and universities really get down to the nitty gritty of housing policy is on their local level with cities, or city government or town government. We can work with local officials to secure necessary zoning amendments. I'll give you all an example of something that we're doing now. UVM owns a piece of property on a part of our campus that already has some housing on it, but we're, for Vermont, the largest city in Burlington. We don't have a lot of room left on our campus for building. What we call Trinity Campus is a parcel where we have some land where we could build housing. However, in order to do that, we need the city to give us some zoning amendments for lot coverage, for setback, and for height, in order that we can build a project that will be efficient from an environmental standpoint and from a student housing standpoint. So we're able to do 3 stories now. We'd like to do 4 or 5 stories. We have the rest of the city has a 15-foot setback from the road. Ours is 115 feet. So we're working with our city council and our mayor to try to change those zoning amendments so that we can build housing on that piece of property. We also have 2 other pieces of property where we're doing similar things. I'll point out that one of the challenges in this area is that we have major interactions with neighbors and the public about our projects and desired outcomes. We'd like to build 500 units of new housing on that Trinity campus. And I've received, I cannot tell you how many emails saying, hey, build 1,000 new units, but make sure it's all 1 story so that we still have the same views that we've had before. Obviously, that's not really efficient and not going to work. And part of this is dealing with city councils or city government, but it's also dealing with the neighbors and the people that live around your campus, which I'm sure that all of you are very familiar with. So next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit about emerging trends in higher ed housing. And Charles, if you have anything to add to as I go through these, please feel free to do that. Enrollment caps. We had a bill that entered into our state legislature this year that wanted to cap UVM's enrollment where it is today, at least on the undergraduate level, tied to the rental vacancy rate in Burlington. We have about 13,500 students at the University of Vermont. About 11,500 of those are undergraduate students. And this bill would have capped our enrollment at that point until the rental housing vacancy rate in the city reached 0.5%. I've lived in Vermont for 22 years, and that rental vacancy rate has never reached 0.1%. So it's always even lower than that. We've got a real crunch. And so we were able to kill that bill this year and not have the state have the ability to cap our enrollment. But we've seen that at other institutions as well, at Berkeley in California, where we're seeing local communities and states really wanting to work to cap enrollment in order to minimize the housing impacts on, especially for off-campus students. We're an institution as a large state public that requires first and second year students to live on our campus. That's kind of unusual. And so we're seeing people, besides asking for enrollment caps, going down to the next point about housing our entire student population on campus. There's a real push locally within Burlington right now to ask us to house all those students on campus. That would not be possible given our physical restrictions with what we have now. We have land holdings in other cities that surround us where we could build housing. It's very unpopular with students to have the option of being bused onto campus. They don't really like that, but I know several other institutions that are dealing with similar requests and would love to hear from folks if you're having that same issue. Creating a non-student perimeter. What I mean by that is having a particular area surrounding your campus off campus where students are not allowed to live. And I'll give the example of Georgetown University, where from a 2-block radius surrounded campus, there can be no student housing. After you get past that 2-block radius, students can start renting again, or you can build housing in that area. But creating a non-student perimeter to have some break from students living off campus is something that we're seeing. Co-housing options. What I mean by that is that there's an effort, at least in our state, to ask students in particular to invest in what we call co-housing, which is, for example, if you have an elderly person that's looking for someone to share their home for reduced rent or no rent, and help that person with like driving them to medical appointments, doing like gardening or cooking or housekeeping. Those are things that we're starting to see. And with the cost of housing on the rise in pretty much all areas of the US, that is something that might start appealing more to students as they're trying to save on housing costs. COVID and post-COVID lessons learned. I think that many of you might have experienced this, and when we start having our question and answer, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. We had a very strong reaction from our neighbors when we sent students home from when we started to shut the university down in March of 2020 for COVID. We were shut down from March until the end of July. We had students come back to campus in August, like many of you did too. We had a huge surge in complaints from neighbors that did not want us to reopen our campus and did not want to bring students back. UVM is an unusual institution as a public in that about 28% of our students are in-state and the rest are from out of state. And our neighbors really objected to us bringing students back from out of state and having them live off campus. They were very fearful that that would have COVID become a rampant epidemic in our state. Vermont was a state that had very low levels of COVID and deaths from COVID throughout the pandemic. When we did bring students back, that wasn't the case. We did not have a COVID epidemic. We engaged in a lot of different strategies, particularly with frequent testing and isolation dorms and things of that nature. But one of the most interesting things about that was having neighbors say to us when students came back that our students provided the best examples of how to behave during COVID, really complying with state and local laws, masking at all times, showing kindness to others, engaging in good behavior that really became a model for how people should live in community with each other during a COVID period of time. So that was super interesting. Neighborhood cooperation projects, we have a lot of things that we use to try to improve relationships, particularly with off-campus housing, community garden aspects in certain neighborhoods, cleanup projects like cleaning up graffiti, cleaning up trash. We do a lot of things that we can do to develop relationships between our students in the neighborhoods where families and working people live in order to incent cooperation and have a good experience for families that are long-term in those neighborhoods and our students who might be more short-term. We're also working very hard at the University of Vermont, and I'm looking forward to hearing people's comments about this as well, in creating housing for more than just students. We are finding that we are having a very difficult time with recruitment of faculty and staff. We're having those folks accept jobs and then tell us that they're not going to take them because the housing is expensive in our area and difficult to find. So we are currently building our first project that will be for graduate students, faculty, and staff to live in. It's located in South Burlington, which is about a mile away from our main campus. We'll have transportation that runs between our campus and that housing unit. We're able to achieve that by working with a third-party developer who is going to manage that. We own the land, they'll do a long-term lease with us on that. I think that that is a way to actually also do some co-housing options that are a little bit different. We're seeing a national trend of municipalities and states wanting us to house other people besides students and besides faculty and staff. For example, creating a housing project where elderly folks who are in independent living can live together with students, faculty, and staff. Also locating things within the housing that we build, like daycares, like adult care, those types of things where we can also link housing opportunities to our academic pedagogy. So those are a bunch of things that are going on. Next slide, please. So lastly, before we go to question and answer, just some tips and tricks to maximize your government relations experience. Call early and often, get to know each other, develop a good working relationship, and plan together while you're doing that. I'll give a great example of when Charles came to UVM. We had a meeting with the general counsel's office and Charles and myself to talk about working around elections in our housing. We see that we have a lot of candidates while they're running for office who want to come into our secure dorm facilities to campaign. We have a university policy against that. That does not stop people from getting into our dorms and doing that. And then I have folks from all the three major parties calling me to tattle on the other candidates that are coming in and actually breaking the rules and campaigning in our dorms. So we worked with Charles to develop a plan where he put up signage to discourage people and remind them that they're not supposed to go into dorms, actually having people on hand to man the doors so that we're not allowing people in that we shouldn't be. That was a really successful cooperative agreement that we had with each other that really diminished the amount of people that we had going into the dorms and breaking our policy. So that was great. There are never any dumb questions. You should feel free to ask lots of questions about legislation or public policy. Those are issues that can be really complicated sometimes, and the folks that work in your government affairs or your general counsel's office work with it on a daily basis and are always willing to help and answer questions. We're here to help you. So continue to reach out to your colleagues in government relations and see what they can do to help you achieve your goals. So I want to say thank you for letting me speak to you and open up the floor to questions. And all of you should, this last slide has my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me anytime, not just today. If you ever have questions about any of these issues, happy to talk and be a sounding board.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Lots of ideas floating around in my head. We actually had one question come in from someone who's a part of PPAC but couldn't make it today. I just wanted to start with just mainly so I don't forget to ask it. So we've started having a few conversations in PPAC meetings that honestly, I think because the questions became too big, we've slowed down on it. But it's this intersection of, so a lot of our staff members live on campus. So we have this like intersection of, so like a residence director, our entry-level staff, right? Like live on, oversee that community. It looks a little different everywhere, but for the most part, we've all got some folks who living on is part of their job expectation. So we've started to have some conversations and heard some states kind of bring up the intersection of what that means. So someone in New York was mentioning on a call. So it would be pretty typical in our like work agreement, work contract to say if you lose your job, you lose your apartment, it's a part of your job. We also need to get someone else in there to do the job. So someone brought up an intersection of eviction law, of employment law. So I would just wonder if you have, in thinking of like this unique thing that, and we've talked to some of our colleagues at ACUHO-I HR, like university HR and professionals, and it's this really unique thing on a college campus that there's this small group of staff that also are tenants in some ways. So just wondering if you have any thoughts on that topic.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is kind of a sticky wicket. And I would say that all states have landlord tenant laws that can be state laws or local laws or a combination of both. And my guess is that at most universities, if a staff member is living on campus, you're going to be required to follow the notice provisions that you have in local and state law regarding landlord tenant. I think the only way that would not be the case is if you have some sort of a special contract with folks. But my guess is that it would still have to follow those laws regardless. So, I mean, I think that you'd have to really take a look at what your local ordinances say about notice requirements for landlord tenant. And if the university is going to ask somebody to leave for cause, then they would have to notify that person with enough notice for that would comply with the state law to give them time to find another place to live. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's where we kind of landed in our last chat about it. Was we think some folks have just kind of not touched the conversation on their campus, and someone else brought up like, right, until someone pushes us on it. And our agreement that we have with the staff member says, you got to be out in a week. And the state, and someone pushes back and says, well, actually, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like it's an area that could be ripe for litigation.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a good thing to bring up. And, it's something that after this conversation, I'll take back to our general counsel's office and consult with them about to make sure that we are working in compliance in that area. But I think it's probably a good time for people to start thinking about, are we in compliance with our state laws or our local laws on this with the contracts that we have with people?
Awesome, thank you. I didn't mean to make more work for you and Charles, it sounds like, with that question, but
No, but I think that's a really good question. Yeah.
Did anyone else have any questions or follow-up from some of the things that Wendy brought up?
Vinny, I think in the way I see us navigate that with students, because how would that be different than a student that we might need to remove from housing as well? And I think we do that in some creative way. I don't actually know. This would have to be a question, as Wendy was saying, to legal counsel, but that's why we don't call it a contract. In fact, we call it a leasing agreement, and they have a license to be able to lease the space. And without that license, you're not eligible to live on campus. And so you can remove someone's license to lease a space quicker and differently than how you navigate a contract. And so that's my limited understanding of how I think universities have tried to maneuver around that. I don't know, Wendy, if you could add some.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at least with the student piece, when students will sign an agreement about their housing, they agree to behave in a particular way. And so because of the university's relationship with them, if they break that contract, then that will supersede anything. It's not a normal landlord-tenant relationship when we refer to students. I think that and I mean, this is an area that is not, I'm not an expert on. So as I said, I would follow up with our general counsel about it, but I think that staff might be a little bit different. I mean, I do see that relationship fall in a different way. And I mean, if a student is asked to leave the university, particularly for a behavioral or criminal or some sort of issue in that way, the law will help to protect the rest of the population at the university through, like a health, safety, and type of clause that we see constitutionally. But so I do think students are a little bit different. I think staff that work on campus that have an agreement, that could be seen in a little bit of a different light.
I found the point you brought up around housing for non-students to be really interesting. I feel like, and folks that are more experts than me in the history of higher education could probably chime in, but I feel like that's, when the academy started, right? That was the idea, right? Like faculty are living on campus for the most part. I grew up in Poughkeepsie around Vassar College, and, basically every street around the college at the time was faculty and staff of the university. Everyone lived on or close to on. And then that kind of pendulumed away, I think, for many reasons, and now for reasons that you're talking about. And not even just some of the financial and zoning pieces, but also some of the like building community pieces, the things that, we've retained some semblance of it with having like faculty and residence programs in some of our at some of our institutions. So I find that interesting. And then also thinking of, we're in this interesting, we just had a presentation from EAB, and in this interesting climate where some folks that are even on the call today are busting at the seams with numbers. Some of our larger land grant public schools some of us that are at small private institutions in the Northeast, not necessarily in the same boat. So there's also some opportunities for, you've got a building, a residence hall that
Right.
you're not filling with first year students, and it's a chance to do some town gown relationship with some of these opportunities that you mentioned. I find that interesting. I find myself thinking about like so many different opportunities for that. I wonder if other folks have similar setups to that, or if you've heard of other approaches.
I think you're right. I think it is interesting. I think the idea of living in community is something that's coming back around. The place where I'm on the board at Sterling College is one of the smallest colleges in America. It has under 90 students. Faculty and staff and students all basically live, if it's not considered on campus, it's adjacent to campus. They eat together, including families and children and all those sorts of things. So that is a model that I think we're seeing come back. I think that you're right. We're a school like UVM, we're finding that we have forced triples that we're trying to build new housing to accommodate students. We're pretty full. We can see a time coming where that might be different. And I do think the idea of, I mean, we've heard it from our city council, our mayor's office, the state, could you either house folks that need housing in housing that you have that's available, or could you build housing for people that need it, that have nothing to do with the university on land that you own, or an adjacent parcel? And I think all of those ideas are meritorious and interesting. I think that as institutions, we have to think about what our liability is with those kinds of things, and also what works. Do I think that there's a way at particular institutions where an elderly population could live with students? Yes. Do I think that that works in every place? Absolutely not. I mean, students may have vastly different lifestyles than, other parts of the population. But I think that there are ways that we can start to think about those things, particularly for institutions that have, as you said, Vinny, housing that might be available that isn't being used for revenue generation. And, maybe what you do is take that entire dorm offline to your students and create housing for community members. And your GC creates contracts that work for that. But there's a lot of different ideas, and even if it isn't necessarily everybody living in the same space, if you can create amenities in some of those places that are helpful for different populations, that's considered a real boon for your town gown relations. If you're helping people in your community receive services that they need, like childcare that can be tied to academic pedagogy, I think that that's a big win.
Yeah, very true.
Wendy, can you talk more about how do you build effective strategies to do the work that you're doing to effect change when there is resistance?
So I think that we work on that a lot, and it's challenging, but I think there's a couple key points. One, I think that a big part of the work that we do in government relations is relationship building and education. So consistently reaching out, meeting with, whether it's in-person calls, attending things like neighborhood planning association meetings on the local level, working with folks so that you know them well enough and have enough trust with them. When you reach a point that you really have problems, you're able to have real discussions with one another about what those solutions will be, with an element of trust, of knowing that you keep your word, knowing that what they can receive from you data-wise or otherwise is trustworthy and is real. We also spend a lot of time on the federal, state, and local level, speaking with our elected representatives about what their needs are and how the university intersects with those needs. And so I work with the president's office and other members of the senior administration to develop every year a legislative strategy plan about what we want to achieve in all three of those areas. And so I think that's pretty commonplace. I think that we reach out to deans and other folks in all of our units to get their input on that. Make sure we're representing the university as a whole in that area, and then talking with elected officials on all of our different levels of government to make sure we're meeting their needs as well, where those can intersect. UVM is unusual, Vermont is unusual in the fact that about half of our board of trustees are elected members of our legislature. And so that helps us to really have good interactions with folks on the state level about what we're working on and how we can help them. I mean, one thing that is really great for government relations where you all can participate, as I said, is serve as expert witnesses. A lot of what we are asked to do is to go into committees and talk about what our work is and how students can participate in government as well. We have a program of student interns at the State House that really research public policy for legislators, and it's become something they rely on. Is really a good program.
Awesome.
I see somebody's hand up.
Yeah, Allery.
Hi, thank you so much. Very interesting information. I'm wondering if you can talk to us if you have any information about the expected Title IX changes that we're expecting to come out any second now, hopefully sooner than later.
I anything that I could tell you right now would be total hearsay. We expected them in May, and we expected them 9 months before that. And so, what I'm hearing is probably the same as what you're hearing, is that we can expect them any day now. What they will end up looking like finally is anybody's guess, really. So I would say keep your eyes peeled. And if you haven't heard anything in a week, I would contact your government relations folks to see if they've heard anything about it. I think once we get through this debt ceiling argument, you'll see something released on it, but that's kind of taken up all the air in the room politically. And so I would say you won't see anything on Title IX until after we get through June 5th and see that we have a debt ceiling agreement done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Sherry, Allery, and I were on the call. We're at a legal issues and student affairs conference at Mississippi State a few weeks ago, and it was a little before I think the debt ceiling talks took over everything. So they're like, probably on your ride back, you'll hear. And now we're like,
yeah, this is sort of the big elephant in the room at the moment. We've got to make sure that we don't default as a country before we get anything else done.
Right. Anyone else have any other questions or things that are on your mind or your institution? We heard of a few things through Charles and Wendy that UVM is kind of thinking through or grappling with. Anything at anyone else's institution that's kind of on their mind in the government relations realm?
Well, as I said before, if you think of anything or you want to talk further about housing or anything else that relates to government relations, please feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Charles. He's an excellent resource too.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And for folks, I think someone asked about the presentation. So we'll have the recording available on the ACUHO-I YouTube channel. And we can send that out. I'll chat with Meredith, who was on here. I believe we also can send it out. And for folks that are on the PPAC listserv, we will send it out as well. But we hope that today, sparked one of our hopes is that this sparks questions, right? That we want to, hear of some things that are on, on the docket at other schools or other states. And that sparks some conversations of, I should be reaching out to my friends over in government relations at my institution. So as I mentioned, if you're interested in joining PPAC, feel free to email me, and Charles and I will get you invited to the monthly meetings. And if you're going to be in Portland, we will be excited to see you. And thank you again, Wendy, for joining us and finding some time to share these insights with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with all of you.
Thank you, everyone.